We're good.
Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to, for some reason, I'm still seeing.
It looks like you stopped sharing, Mark.
I did that on purpose.
Oh, okay.
What I'm wondering is why I can't tell whether I'm on screen or not.
You are.
Oh, okay, for some reason, I'm not on mine.
Oh.
Okay. All right, sorry about that, folks. And welcome to the symposium, What has SageSTEP learned about sagebrush ecosystem recovery after 10+ years of post-treatment monitoring. This session is part of the Society for Range Management's annual meeting. And with help from the Great Basin Fire Science Exchange, we've also been able to open it up to others who were unable to register for the conference. My name is Mark Brunson, and I'll be your moderator today. First, I'd like to present a few ground rules. Speakers, remind you to remain muted until it's time for you to speak. Other folks who are attending, please also remain muted. And it's best if you turn your video off as well. That may affect the bandwidth for the session, but it's also important because the session is being recorded. And for people who want to view it later, and remaining muted with the video off reduces the chances of a potentially embarrassing glitch, such as your preteen forgetting to turn off the kitten filter in Zoom. We all heard about that happening last week. Today, I'm going to offer a brief introduction to the SageSTEP project, and then we'll hear research presentations from 4 members of our research project team, followed by a half-hour Q&A discussion session. Because there are so many of us, I'll be reading questions you put into the chat rather than opening up the floor for questions. You can enter your questions anytime you wish, but I'll hold all questions to the discussion session unless I see one that's purely a point of clarification that can be answered very quickly. Once we begin sharing the screen for our presentations, you can also see the speaker if you click on Speaker View versus Gallery View. You can set that by using that checkerboard item in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. Also, before I begin my introduction, I'd like to make this statement of acknowledgement. The research and management applications that you'll hear about today have been conducted on the original ancestral lands of the Paiute, Goshute, Ute, Western Shoshone, Washoe, Yakima, Wenatchee, and other tribes of the Great Basin and Columbia Plateau. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced removal from the land, and we honor and respect the indigenous people still connected to the land on which we work. So with that, I would like to begin with my introduction. So what I'd like to present to you today is just a little bit of overview on what and who is SageSTEP. This project has been going for quite a while, and it's possible that some of you are less familiar with it than others of you. And the slide that really, to me, best demonstrates why this project exists is this one that was prepared with photos from Robin Tausch, who's one of our researchers, now retired from the Forest Service. And back in 1973, Robin took this photograph on the left in the Shoshone Mountains of central Nevada. The photo on the right was taken from essentially the same exact point, but 32 years later. And so we can see how vegetation has changed in the Great Basin during that time. And not only is conifer encroaching, but we also had an increase in annual invasive grasses. And so vegetation conditions by the early 2000s, when we began talking about this research, had changed quite a bit. while we still had 57 million acres of sagebrush dominated rangeland in the region, that was only 2/3 of the historic level. So if it's a little hard to see in this photograph on the left, but you may be able to notice that some of the area is redder than the other. And so you can begin to see the effects of cheatgrass invasion. In the meantime, we also had a number of locations, quite a bit of landscape that was susceptible to encroachment by conifers. And so, and when that happens, you end up with a situation where what starts off as a savanna becomes an open woodland, becomes a closed canopy woodland. And then when it burns, and burnt fires can move very quickly across that closed canopy woodland, you end up with maybe a few scattered trees and an awful lot of cheatgrass. And so for those reasons, we wanted to begin to understand, what could we do about that? So that was born the Sagebrush Steppe Treatment Evaluation Project, or SageSTEP. We began work with a planning grant in 2003. By 2005, we were funded to begin the research. And what we had created was a regional experiment to assess the effects of prescribed fire and other fuels treatments on pinyon and juniper woodland and on cheatgrass-invaded scrubland. And so in addition to controls at 21 different sites, we had locations where we had, put in some prescribed fire, used chainsaw cutting in a fell and drop process where the trees were left in place after having been cut. In Utah, we were able to use mastication as another treatment. And we had 14 of those woodland sites. There's other variations among them, and you may hear about some of that in the presentations you hear later today. And we had 7 sites that were in the process of being invaded by cheatgrass, and they were shrubland sites. Again, those were burned. They were mowed to reduce the shrub canopy and open up the canopy. And then there were a couple of different herbicide treatments applied in different ways for different reasons, using both tebuthyron and imazepyc. So you can see on the map on the right that we have, sites extending all the way from southwestern Utah to north central Washington, and from northeast California to the very northeast corner of the sagebrush Great Basin floristic region north of Idaho Falls, Idaho. From 2005 until 2010, we were in our treatment implementation and short-term effects studies. This was an intensive research project with many different aspects being studied, from humans to wildlife to plants, insects. This was funded by the Joint Fire Science Program, possibly still the most extensive project they've ever funded. And then since 2011, we shifted into a long-term monitoring phase. We've enjoyed continued support from the Bureau of Land Management and the National Interagency Fire Center. And so we've been able to monitor over a much longer period of time. And you can see some of the effects with this photo sequence that we have here from a site near Scipio, Utah, one of our woodland sites, where you can see what it looked like prior to mastication. 3 years later, you see a site that's got a fair amount of woody debris and quite a bit of cheatgrass. 2017, a lot of the cheatgrass was missing, and also a lot of the down woody debris, but we hadn't seen a whole lot of visible recovery. So, each of those sites have had different kinds of trajectories, and we've been keeping track of all that. But we've also had an interesting situation where wildfires have burned either partially or wholly at least 7 of our 21 sites. And so this tells us, one, about the great need for this project, and second of all, how we've been able to add yet another phase of our project to look what happens after wildfire. A lot of people have been involved in this. As I mentioned, there were a number of different aspects that we were studying. Obviously, the main portion was what happened to vegetation, but we looked at fire and fuel conditions. We've looked at soils, wildlife, including butterflies and ants. We've had some spatial and statistical analysis, hydrology, which you'll hear about later. There was a social science and economic component. And there's at least 30 names on this slide, plus we've had dozens of graduate students and undergraduate technicians who have learned through the SageSTEP project. And we're really pretty proud of that impact, which goes beyond the research itself. For those of you who are interested in learning more, we also maintain a very active outreach program. We continue to do that. We have a website here. The URL is in the upper left-hand corner. And that site has many resources available for people. So for example, this particular, we're currently in the process of developing a special issue of journal articles in the journal Ecosphere, the online journal. And these will be available for folks to be able to read that really talk about the kinds of things you'll hear about today, and the talks today are based on that. But there's many other publications. If you go to our website, you'll find links to many journal articles, with PDFs so that you have access. There are a number of different kinds of reports. Here are two of our more recent ones. A general technical report about eco-hydrologic impacts, fuels guides that was recently published. And we have many other kinds of resources, including infographics and Facebook. We're on Facebook. We have a blog that you can access from this site. And we're still going, and there are opportunities for people to work with us or work in our sites. And so if you're interested in research on these kinds of areas, look at our website, see what we're doing, and you'll get a chance to see whether maybe you could fit in with our research, as long, and we're willing to consider options if it doesn't interfere with the other kinds of activities that we're doing. So with that, I would like to go to the main research presentations now. You've heard my overview. There will be 4 speakers, but before they do that, we'd like to introduce the first of several polls that we'll put forth just to help us understand a little bit more about who you are, and also give you something to do other than just sit and listen to us talk. Shania, are the answers still coming in, or should we post what we learned?
74% have voted.
Okay.
77, 78, 79, 80. I don't know how long you want to go.
Let's see what we got.
Okay.
Okay, so excellent researchers, but we also have a fairly healthy group of researchers, of agency managers are the majority, which is kind of the audience we most like to reach, but we also are glad to see a lot of researchers and students. So with that, I am going to stop my screen and introduce Lisa Ellsworth. Lisa is one of our research leaders, along with Dr. Beth Newingham, so you'll hear from her later. Lisa is a professor in the Oregon State University in the Fisheries and Wildlife Department.
Great, thank you, Mark, and thank you for setting up the project so well. I am appreciative of all of you for being here today in this very strange format. I'm going to use my time today to talk about the impacts of the fuel treatments that we've been monitoring over the past 10+ years on potential fire behavior. I'd like to acknowledge my collaborators first. Here with me at Oregon State University is Claire Williams, Beth Newingham with the Agricultural Research Service at the USGS, Scott Schaff and Dave Pike, Ava Strand at the University of Idaho, Matt Reeves and Jean Chambers at the Rocky Mountain Research Station, and Gino Shoup at Utah State University. All were instrumental in getting this work done. So Mark set up the project nicely, but I'll talk a little bit more specifically about the Sage cheat portion of the network. He described to you that there's a woodland network and a Sage cheat network. And the objective of the Sage cheat network was to look at plots that are sagebrush dominated, but with some degree of cheatgrass invasion. And so for this part of the research, we looked at 10 years of monitoring data on that Sage cheat network. We looked at 6 plots across the sagebrush steppe. They're represented here in this map, 2 in eastern Washington, 2 in eastern Oregon, 1 in Nevada, and 1 in Utah. These plots each had 4 treatments. There was a tebuthyron treatment, which is an herbicide intended to kill part of the shrub canopy, a mechanical thinning, which chopped off a portion of the sagebrush itself, sometimes killing the plants, sometimes leaving parts of them alive, prescribed fire, and untreated control. Half of the subplots at each of these plots were also treated with imazapic to suppress cheatgrass invasion. So there's 8 treatments, 4 main treatments with the cross of imazapic. Mark mentioned that this is an interdisciplinary data set with lots of things being monitored, including vegetation, biomass, wildlife, hydrology, economics, as well as human dimensions. And the treatments were co-designed with land managers to evaluate treatment options that folks are considering using on the ground. And so what I'll be doing today is thinking about the vegetation from a perspective of fuels, the flammable material that's out there on the rangelands, and assess the impacts of those treatments on potential fire behavior. So the research questions that I had were, which fuel treatments have the greatest impact on potential fire behavior? For how long do any treatments function as a fuel break, reducing the intensity and spread of a future wildfire? And do these relationships change throughout the fire season as fuels cure and become increasingly flammable? So this is some data that one of my colleagues on the project, Bruce Roundy, put out in Ecosphere a couple of years ago. Here he was looking at the cover of, in the top panel, cheatgrass, and the bottom perennial herbaceous cover. This is looking at 6 sites. Within each site, there's the untreated treatment, untreated plot, burn treatment, mechanical treatment, and herbicide treatment. On the top panel, the green bars are pre-treatment. The red bars are 6 years post-treatment. So what we're looking at here is how cheatgrass changed as a result of these different management treatments. And what I want you to notice, first of all, is the incredible variability that we saw from site to site. But where we did see an herbaceous response, it tended to be in the mow and burn treatments. If you look down below, this bottom panel is showing perennial herbaceous cover in the same 6 plots and the same treatments. Here we've got the green bars are pre-treatment and the blue bars are bunch grasses, 6 years post-treatment. So it's mostly in the plots where we didn't have that big cheatgrass flush. We tended to have more perennial bunch grasses. And I think Gene Chambers' talk later today will get at some of those soil temperature, soil moisture gradients that contribute to the different inherent plant communities and resistance and resilience at those sites. I want to just give you a pictorial representation of what some of these plots look like. This is one of our fire plots prior to treatment. So I've got the treatment year is going to be in the top right for all of these, and the treatment here on the top left. So this is prior to treatment, 1 year following treatment. So you'll see that a lot of that fuel was gone, but some herbaceous stuff starting to come back. 2 years after treatment, we get quite a bit of herbaceous material, both native bunch grasses as well as some undesirable invasives. 3 years, starting to get some pretty dense herbaceous cover there. Year 6, that persists, not a lot of shrubs starting to come back in. Here we'll look at the mow treatment. This is year 0 prior to treatment. 1 year post-treatment, you can see that some of those shrubs are chopped off and are not going to make it, but there's still a shrub canopy that's there. Our goal was to get about half of the shrubs thinned out with that treatment. In year 2, we're starting to see a nice herbaceous response. Again, depending on what site we were at, it may have been dominated by native perennial bunch grasses. In some of the plots, we did get a lot of cheatgrass. By year 6, those perennial bunch grasses are responding nicely. The tebuthyron treatment was an interesting one. The goal of this treatment was to thin the shrub canopy using chemicals. But what we found was that this is year 0. Year 1, it didn't really do anything. And it wasn't until about year 6 that we really started to see that thinning of the canopy and replacing of, about half of the live shrubs with standing dead shrubs. So we quantified these different fuel parameters every year for 10 years. And I'm going to show you here data from years 0, 1, 2, 3, 6, and 10. So what we're looking at across the x-axis here are the control plot, the fire plots, mechanical, and tebuthyron, and each one of these has a time series embedded within it. This is fuel loads on the y-axis. Each one of these bars is made up of different fuel components. So the herbaceous component is represented by these bottom striped bars. The kind of bricks are the litter component. The black solid blocks are the shrubs, and then the polka dots are downed woody, the coarse woody material from the dead shrubs. So what I want you to notice, first of all, is that fire removed far more biomass than any of the other treatments, and it was largely that shrub component, but also some of the coarse woody debris that was removed. The mechanical treatment moved some of that live shrub component into the coarse wood component. Tebuthyron, you can see that delayed response in the black bars where years 0, 1, and 2, we still have lots of live shrubs, and it's not until years 3, somewhere in between 3 and 6, that it really starts to drop out. But the total fuel in the tebuthyron treated plots was never lower than the controls. So we wanted to see what that might mean in terms of the risk of a potential wildfire. So we used a fire behavior modeling framework called the Fuel and Fire tool. This is a non-spatial fire behavior modeling tool. It uses FCCS fuel beds as the starting point, but you can go into the interface and modify all of the fuel's inputs based on your in situ fuel loads. And then it predicts things like rate of spread, flame length, reaction intensity, some of those surface fire behavior metrics that we're interested in. And we used it to test the difference between these management treatments. And then simulated what it would look like as fuels cured out. So as we move from early fire season into late in the game when things get crispy. So we used, for the purposes of today's talk, the data from 6 sites, years 0, 1, 2, 3, 6, and 10, and built custom fuel models for each site, or each plot at each site at each time step. This is just what the interface looks like, where you can go in and modify from the FCCS standard fuel beds to create site-specific fuel characterizations. And then we set fuel moisture profiles that represent the range of fuel moisture conditions from early season through late in the fire season. And this is what we found. So this is a graph that's looking at, on the y-axis is rate of spread. We're looking at the 6 different years, years 0, 1, 2, 3, 6, and 10. Each graph shows the change through time from, on the left is when the herbaceous fields are fully green, through 1/3 cured, 2/3 cured, and then fully cured scenarios. The different colors and symbols represent the different treatments. So actually can't, there's Zoom stuff in the way. The controls are the red and orange control and control plus imazapic. The triangles represent the hollow one is fire, the filled-in one is fire plus imazapic. The squares are mechanical, and the diamonds are tebuthyron. So in year 0, prior to treatment, they're all pretty similar. What we see right away following treatment is that the mechanical, which is the squares, and the triangles or the fire plots had quite a bit lower fire behavior. And this one is rate of spread in particular. Year 2, the pattern still holds, but it's, some plots are starting to come back. We do still see the mechanical and fire, especially the ones that were also treated with imazapic those first couple of years, having lower rates of spread than the control or the tebuthyron plots. And this holds all the way through year 10. So we're going to zoom in and look just at this fully cured scenario, which is when we're at the greatest risk of wildfire. So this is looking across all of the variability across all of the plots in these different treatments. Again, we've got the reds and oranges are controls, fire and mechanical. We continue to have lowered rates of spread in those treatments all the way through year 10. Our flame lengths, this is a similar graph looking at a different fire behavior metric, same treatment categories across the same years. And we see this same pattern of the fire treatments and mechanical treatments resulting in lowered modeled flame length than the control or tebuthyron treatments. And again, this holds all the way through year 10. We've got significantly lowered flame lengths in those treatments. And this one in particular, I think will be of interest to managers. There's a rule of thumb that when flame lengths are under 4 feet, you can use hand tools and ground crews to suppress that fire. And when flame lengths reach between 4 and 8 feet, it takes some heavy equipment. It takes machinery to get in there and effectively suppress that fire. So our fire and mechanical plots get us below that threshold almost all the time. And the tebuthyron and control plots are pretty consistently above that threshold. And when you're above that 8-foot threshold, that's when you're at risk of running fires, crowning, spotting, and you can't as effectively suppress those fires with ground resources. So the final metric that we looked at was reaction intensity. And this is a measure of the amount of heat being generated per unit area. In year 0, they're all the same. Reductions with the fire plus imazapic, mechanical, and mechanical plus imazapic that again hold for the most part, well into this time post-treatment trajectory. So what does that mean? I think that we've shown that the Mo treatment and the prescribed fire treatment can reduce future fire intensity when looked at from a fire behavior modeling perspective. But we want to acknowledge that there might be a significant trade-off in some of the talks that you'll hear today. Some of my colleagues will talk about the invasive grass response in some of these treatment plots. And while the prescribed fire treatment did result in reduced potential fire behavior, in some cases there's a trade-off with increased annual grass, as y'all are well aware. There are site-specific effects across this soil temperature and moisture gradient, as Jean Chambers will talk about later today. We had a different response of the plant communities. In some cases, we had good native perennial bunchgrass response. In other places, it was more invasive plant dominated. So that's something to consider when looking across the whole network. And finally, we're making this assumption that we do these disturbances as fuel reduction treatments, and then when a wildfire eventually comes through, that there will be a net benefit by having the treatment out there first. However, we do need to consider the possibility that the second disturbance added to the first, might not be a net gain, but it might be, there may be negative impacts of having multiple repeat disturbances. So with that, I will thank in particular our funding partners who have made this happen over a very long time series. And there's contact information for me up there. I'm seeing some flashes for questions, but I think we're going to take them at the end. Is that right, Mark?
That's correct. Yeah.
All right. Thank you all.
Yeah. To some extent, a couple of us are answering questions in the chat as we go, if they're quick, easily answered, but we want to leave some time for during the question and answer session where we can have a little broader discussion. Before we go to the next talk, we have another poll we'd like to ask people to fill out. And this is just for our own information. There's not a whole lot that you have to answer here. Okay, great. Yeah, this was, we're really grateful to the Society for Range Management for allowing us to have an option where we can open this meeting to people who weren't able to attend the session. That's one of the advantages of being in a virtual setting. Although as I looked at the participants and I saw all the friends that I'm not going to meet, I would say I'd still rather be in person. With that, I want to introduce our next speaker, who is Dr. Jean Chambers. Jean should be known to very many of you. She is a longtime Forest Service research scientist who has recently retired, although I suspect that that doesn't mean that you're going to slow down a whole lot.
I've been keeping busy.
Okay, great.
All right, I'll share my screen here. Hopefully everyone can see that. First of all, welcome everyone, and very glad that you could join us today. My talk is going to focus in on sagebrush recovery patterns after fuel treatments and the effects of disturbance type, and then also community interactions. My co-authors are Ali Urza, Dave Board, and Robin Tausch from RMRS, Rick Miller, Emeritus, Oregon State, Dave Pike, USGS, Bruce Roundy, Brigham Young, and then also Gino Shoup, Utah State University. So as most of us know, the impetus for fuel treatments and really the sagebrush treatment evaluation project is stronger than ever. We're seeing progressive expansion, not only of cheatgrass, but also of other invaders like medusa head and ventonata, and it's resulting in the development of invasive grass fire cycles. There's continued expansion of pinyon and juniper into our sagebrush ecosystems, and it's increasing the risk of high severity fires and subsequent conversion of our warmer and drier systems to cheatgrass and other annual grasses. And of course, climate change is resulting in longer fire seasons and more severe fire weather. The overarching objective of most of our landscape fuel treatments is to increase resilience or the potential to recover after wildfire, and resistance to invasive annual grasses. That is, of course, in addition to reducing fuels and increasing perennial native grasses and forbs. With progressive losses of sagebrush ecosystems and numerous sagebrush-dependent species, we're seeing an increased focus on maintaining sagebrush density and cover really across the entire sagebrush biome. We know that sagebrush seedling establishment and population recruitment is a major bottleneck for sagebrush ecosystem recovery. Sagebrush are, of course, killed by fire. They're obligate seeders with small, short-lived seed and low dispersal distances. And several recent studies have sort of strongly indicated that sagebrush population recruitment is typically low, and it's highly dependent not only on annual weather conditions, but also site conditions. In particular, recruitment is episodic, and it requires cool and moist springs. Now, the treatment effects on sagebrush populations depend on several different factors. This is the disturbance of the severity, the post-disturbance vegetation composition and structure, and then also something we know about, but often don't think that closely about, is the amount of soil water and nutrients that are released by the disturbance. Recent work by Gentz and White suggests that we can categorize disturbances and therefore our field treatments according to really two different kinds of events. The first are pulse events, such as fire, prescribed fire, that result really in abrupt changes in ecological attributes and processes. The second really is longer-term presses. These are things like that tebuthyron treatment, the slow-acting herbicide that Lisa was talking about, that have relatively low magnitude effects, but can result in longer-term ecosystem changes. Of course, one of the reasons we're interested in both the severity of disturbance and the amount of resources that are released is because it significantly influences sagebrush population processes and competitive interactions among all the dominant life forms. We know that when we have increases in resources, we can see increased sagebrush seed production and population recruitment, but we can also have competitive release of perennial grasses, which can decrease sagebrush recruitment. And then we can have competitive release of annual grasses and see decreased recruitment of both sagebrush and perennial grasses. In this sagebrush STEP study, the primary objective was to evaluate the effects of our woody fuel treatments on sagebrush population processes and plant functional group interactions, really those competitive interactions over time. The first hypothesis was that removing all plant cover, such as through prescribed fire, can disrupt the relationships among sagebrush density and cover and really alter those competitive interactions with perennial and annual grasses. Removing trees, such as through cut and leave treatments, without affecting sagebrush, can increase sagebrush density and cover, and it can also affect annual and perennial grass cover. Preferentially reducing sagebrush, such as through that long-term tebuthyron treatment, can alter feedbacks among sagebrush density and cover, and it can also result, again, in that increase in annual and perennial grass cover. In this study, we looked at both the woodland sites and the sagebrush cheatgrass sites, the sage cheat sites. What's important here is that our woodland sites typically tend to be cooler and moister. They're characterized by Wyoming big sage and blue bunch wheatgrass on some sites, and mountain big sage and Idaho fescue on other sites. The sage cheat sites are generally warmer and drier, and thus they have lower resilience and resistance. They tend to be characterized by Wyoming big sage and then blue bunch wheatgrass or Thurber's needlegrass. The treatments we looked at were the controls, the late summer prescribed fire, and the mechanical cut and leave treatment in the woodland sites. And then in the sage cheat sites, the control late summer prescribed fire, mowing to a height of 35 centimeters, and then tebuthyron applied at a rate of 1.68 kilograms per hectare. Now, to better understand how sagebrush population components interacted with each other and the two other dominant functional groups that we were looking at, annual and perennial grasses, we used piecewise structural equation models, SEMs. The conceptual model is shown on the right. The model was designed to evaluate year-to-year changes in sagebrush seedling density, juvenile and adult density, and sagebrush cover in order to better understand population processes such as survival, establishment, intraspecific interactions, and recruitment or mortality. It was also designed to evaluate the interactions of sagebrush seedlings, juveniles, and adults with annual and perennial grasses to better understand competitive interactions. It included 5 discrete time steps. These included pre-treatment and years 1, 2, 3, 6, and 10 after treatment. We conducted complementary mixed effects ANOVAs for both the woodland and the sage cheat sites. These included treatment, time since treatment, and treatment by time since treatment interactions. Now, before I start discussing the results, I'd like you to look at the SEM in the lower right-hand corner. In the SEMs, solid arrows indicate significant positive relationships and dashed arrows indicate negative relationships. The relationships are labeled with their standard coefficient, and you can see that associated with each of the arrows. Tree was pre-treatment tree cover, AGR, annual invasive grass cover, SDL, seedling density, DEN, sagebrush juvenile and adult density, COV, sagebrush cover, PGR, perennial grass cover, and SDL, seedling density. Tree cover was included only in time 0. And now that that explanation is finished, we can move on to discussing the results. In the controls on the woodland sites, what we saw was a long-term press disturbance and ongoing resource competition. And this was indicated by the negative effect of pre-treatment tree cover on both sagebrush and perennial grass cover. And we can see that right here. There. Might work a little bit better. The sagebrush seedlings or juveniles were positively related to sage cover at most time steps. And so we saw the interactions between the different components of sagebrush with density or seedlings consistently occurring. What this indicated to us was that these positive relationships among the sagebrush components indicated relatively consistent feedbacks that can really help maintain sagebrush populations during the initial phases of expansion. Now, if we look at prescribed fire, our short duration, high magnitude pulse disturbance, we saw that the associations among our sagebrush seedlings, juvenile and adult density and cover were decoupled immediately after fire, as you might expect. Total disruption of those population processes. However, in these relatively cool and moist woodland sites, they were regained within about 2 to 3 years after that disturbance. Sagebrush recruitment was highly dependent on site conditions, and Lisa talked a little bit about how variable these sites are, and we know that they range from Wyoming, big sage sites, to some fairly high elevation mountain big sage sites. In the fire treatment, we saw fairly large increases in our perennial grasses, but we also saw large increases in the annual grass. And in fact, the increases in grasses in general were as high as any of our observed treatments. One of the things that we have observed elsewhere, and that I think is significant here, is that perennial grass was negatively related to annual grass in several different time steps before we started to see large increases in those annual grasses. If we look at our mechanical sites, those cut and leave treatments, what we saw was that sagebrush cover and density interactions were really similar to the controls. We saw consistent interactions in the years following treatment. In this particular treatment, we had higher sagebrush population recruitment and sagebrush cover than in any of the other treatments. And although we saw an increase in perennial grass cover, and this increase was similar to fire, the increase in annual grass was lower. Now, if we move on to our sage cheat sites, we can look first at the control. These sites were fenced before the treatments were implemented, and what we believe we saw here was a release from grazing pressure. And what we saw and why we believe there was a release from grazing pressure is that even on the controls, we had an increase in both annual and perennial grasses over time. And we saw that kind of consistently across the controls. In these control sites, the sagebrush interactions were really less frequent and consistent than what we saw for the woodland control plots. And you can see there just aren't as many connecting arrows here. The annual and perennial grass increased over time again, and that increase had negative effects on sagebrush seedling density in the last time step. Now, if we move on to those fire sites, that short duration, high magnitude pulse, we again saw that sagebrush associations were decoupled, but unlike the woodland sites, this occurred in several different time steps and was still occurring between years 3 and 6. Sagebrush recruitment was low and highly variable on these sites. Both annual and perennial grasses increased over time, and as you might expect, they were as high as we saw on any of the other treatments. One of the things that was significant in this particular set of sites was that sagebrush cover had negative relationships with annual grass cover in almost all time steps. We look at the mowing treatment, that short duration, low to intermediate pulse. We saw an immediate decrease in sagebrush and juvenile and adult density. The interspecific associations, those connections, were really decoupled in the initial time step. Annual grass increased significantly over time and had negative effects on sagebrush recruitment in the initial time steps. Once the resources were partitioned, reallocated among the sagebrush, residual sagebrush, and then also the grasses and forbs, the interactions decreased significantly. If we look at the tebuthyron application treatment, that multi-year press, as Lisa noted, we did see continued decreases in sagebrush cover and then juvenile and adult density all the way through year 6. And although sagebrush cover was variable over the years, by year 10, it was really similar to what we saw in the mowing treatment. In this treatment, we had delayed sagebrush mortality coupled with an increase in annual grass, and it resulted in strong negative interactions between sagebrush and annual grass, as we saw in some of the other treatments. Now, in terms of the implications, our cooler and moister woodland sites did have those more consistent feedbacks among sagebrush population processes, and we would expect that of sites that are more resilient and resistant. In terms of the mechanical treatment, we saw positive effects of sagebrush recruitment, and then we also saw increases in not only perennial grass cover, but also sagebrush cover over time. This particular treatment had smaller increases in annual grass cover than the other treatments, and it has potential to increase R&R, resilience and resistance of these sites, when properly implemented. In terms of prescribed fire in the woodland sites, we did have those positive effects on perennial grass, but sagebrush recruitment and recovery was really highly dependent on site conditions, and it varied among years and among time and over time. The potential to increase resilience and resistance on these particular sites is going to require careful attention to things like pre-fire site conditions. Are there sufficient perennial grasses and forbs to result in post-fire site recovery? Fire application techniques? Can patches of sagebrush be left unburned to provide a future sagebrush seed source? And does post-fire monitoring show that sagebrush seeding may be needed on some of these sites? If we look next at those sage cheat sites, these warmer and drier sites had fewer and less consistent feedbacks among those sagebrush population processes, and the large increases in cheatgrass that we saw on many of these sites probably further altered these interactions. In terms of the prescribed fire treatment, we had generally low sagebrush recruitment and cover even 10 years after fire, and we saw an increase in perennial grasses, but that was accompanied by large increases in cheatgrass. Mowing reduced sage cover, again with little recruitment. There was higher perennial grass, at least in our analyses, and then lower cheatgrass than we saw in either the fire or tebuthyron treatments. Tebuthyron, again, reduced sagebrush cover over longer periods of time, but there was little to no sagebrush recruitment. In this particular treatment, there was no increase in perennial grass, but there were similar increases in cheatgrass to prescribed fire. Potential to increase resilience and resistance and maintain sagebrush cover is relatively low on these sites. However, it may be possible to rethink some of the requirements or some of the guidelines for conducting treatments on these types of sites. For example, it may be possible to use minimums of perennial native grass and forb cover to determine if these relatively low resilience and resistance sites should receive field treatments. Our prior work on these sites and work that has been done elsewhere by folks like Kirk Davies indicate that between 15 to 20% cover of perennial native grasses and forbs is required to prevent increases in cheatgrass following these types of treatments. And other work that is ongoing by Lee Condon and Dave Pike is showing that biological soil crusts can impede cheatgrass, and treatments should focus on avoiding disrupting them to the degree possible. And with that, I think we're ready for the next speaker, Mark.
Great, thanks very much, Jean. But first I want to ask, I've got another poll for you. While we're waiting, you can really enjoy Nolan Priest's wonderful photograph. Oh, well, I guess it's gone now. But Nolan's photos are always amazing. Yes, thanks, Matt. Okay. All right, that's really helpful to us. You know, for a lot of times when we talk with people about SageSTEP, we're talking to people who we've spoken to many times. So it's great to know that there are people who are new to the project who are learning today. So I want to turn the time over to Dr. Beth Newingham, who is a research ecologist with the USDA Agricultural Research Service in Reno. Beth, along with Lisa Ellsworth, is our current co-leader, and I do want to give a shout out to Jim McKeever, who was our fearless leader for the first 15 years of the project. Beth, go ahead.
Thanks, Mark. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so as has been mentioned, you know, woody plant expansion has been driving ecosystem change in grasslands and shrublands for over a century now, and this certainly applies to the Great Basin. So in efforts to reduce these ecosystem impacts, various field treatments have been implemented with the goal of reducing woody species and hopefully releasing those understory species. But we really lack long-term data to know whether or not these treatments are effective and how they affect those understory community trajectories. So today I'd like to talk about how conifer removal treatments have affected the sagebrush understory plant communities after being treated about 10 years ago across the Great Basin. So for those of you that aren't familiar with pinyon juniper woodlands, they cover about 70,000 square miles of the Great Basin and the Colorado Plateau. And this extent has certainly increased. So PJ extent has increased about 125 to 625% since the late 19th century. And in central Nevada alone, we've had an increase in pinyon juniper woodlands of 11% in just 3 decades. So there are several proposed reasons for this increase in these woodlands. One is due to a shifting climate. Another is historic overgrazing. There's also been some settlement era tree harvesting where a lot of trees are removed and some may just be coming back from that removal. And then we also have altered fire regimes with fire suppression that have not kept those trees at bay. And the reason we're concerned about this is that these extended woodlands can result in high severity fires as well as reduced sage-grouse habitat. So there are 2 primary fuel treatments that are used to reduce pinyon juniper, and they're prescribed fire and mechanical removal. And mechanical removal is usually some form of mastication or lop and scatter treatment. And these fuel treatments are intended to reduce woody fuels with the hopes that it's going to enhance resilience to wildfire, increase resistance to plant invasions, and hopefully improve sagebrush obligate wildlife habitat. So again, we have the unique opportunity to use the SageSTEP experimental network for this. So again, it was established in 2006, and we have about 10 years worth of data. So as others have mentioned, there is the cheatgrass network. I'm actually going to focus on the woodland network here. So the cheatgrass sites are in with yellow symbols, and the green sites are the woodland symbols. And we're going to focus on the 2 treatments of prescribed fire and mechanical tree removal. So in this analysis, we used 10 of those woodland sites. As you can see, they're spread throughout the West. And so they cover a few different vegetation communities or dominant tree species. So we have Western juniper, single needle pinyon and Utah juniper, and then Colorado pinyon and Utah juniper. So my general research question today is, what are the understory responses to these conifer removal treatments after 10 years? And I also want to add a caveat to that and ask whether or not these understory responses vary by pre-treatment tree dominance and soil temperature and moisture regimes. So we have both biotic and abiotic gradients across these sites that might influence understory responses. And just so you know, we just had the paper come out a week or 2 ago in a special issue of Ecosphere, so you can check out more details in that paper. And it's open access, which is great. Okay, so let me describe these environmental gradients. So first is tree dominance. So when, phases of woodland development have been described in different phases, where phase 1, your trees are minor, as you can see here in the first photo. In phase 2, trees are co-dominant. In phase 3, trees are dominant, and you really can see a depleted understory here. The other way to think about this is using tree dominance index, or TDI, and it's relatively easy to calculate. So you take tree cover and you divide it by total vegetative cover of trees, shrubs, and perennial grasses. So over here on the right, on the x-axis, as we go from left to right, we increase our tree dominance index. And this is the cover of the 2 different functional groups of here trees, which go up with tree dominance index, and then your perennial understories tend to go down with an increase in tree dominance. And then, as Jean has mentioned, there's also environmental gradients of soil temperature and moisture regimes. So again, we have 10 different sites for this particular analysis, as you can see here, and then we have 4 different sites. Here are our dominant tree species, and all these sites are along a gradient of annual precipitation as well as elevation. So we are interested in how these might, understory might respond across these environmental gradients of soil temperature and moisture regimes. So just to explain, the frigid xeric sites in the woodland sites are considered cool and moist sites. And then the mesic aeritic or mesic xeric sites are the warm and dry sites. So Jean was talking about sometimes a bigger gradient of that soil temperature and moisture regime. I'm just talking about the gradient within the woodland treatments. And the reason we have stratified these by soil temperature and moisture regimes is that previous research has showed that there is higher resistance and resilience at the cool and moist sites versus the warm and dry sites. So for our experimental design, there were 3 treatments at the woodland sites that I'm going to talk about today. There's a mastication treatment as well, but I'm not going to talk about that. So we have control plots at each site, prescribed fire, and then lob and scatter. And both of these treatments were applied in the fall, and the prescribed fire treatment resulted in a tree reduction of about 63 to 100%, whereas the lob and scatter reduced trees by 96 to 100%. And then all of these plots have been sampled throughout time, both pre-treatment as well as in years 1, 3, 6, and 10. It's a lot of data. I am only going to present to you the change over the 10 years, and the manuscript will have many more details of each one of those years. So again, we're interested in understory responses. So we measured understory cover using a line point intercept. And we extended some of the functional groups that previously had been examined in the SageSTEP network. So we have 8 different functional groups of Artemisia shrubs, other shrubs, and a lot of these include some resprouters, perennial forbs, native annual forbs, exotic annual forbs, our perennial graminoids, annual grasses, and we've also included biocrust. And then we also took this in further detail, and we looked at the effects on 3 different shrub species of big sagebrush, rabbitbrush, and bitterbrush, as well as perennial grasses of Sandberg's bluegrass, blue bunch wheatgrass, Indian ricegrass, Idaho fescue, and bottlebrush squirreltail. So we're going to jump into the results here, and these graphs will get a little bit busy, but I'm going to walk you through them so it's pretty easy to understand. So always on the left-hand side, I'm going to have the warm and dry sites. On the right-hand side will be the cool and moist sites. So we're going to start off with the dominant functional groups. And so in black is Artemisia shrubs, other shrubs are in blue, green are perennial grasses, and yellow is annual grasses. So we're looking at the change in cover over time. So if it's above this dotted line, there's an increase in cover. If it's below the dotted line, it's a decrease in cover. And again, we have it across this tree dominance index. Okay, so going functional group by functional group, for Artemisia shrubs, we can see that the prescribed fire had a negative effect on Artemisia cover over time at low TDI, but not at high TDI. The mechanical treatments, we can see there's an increase in Artemisia shrubs somewhat, and it was less dependent upon TDI. We look at the other shrubs, we see slight responses to both treatments, and that also varied upon TDI. And those responses varied depending on the treatment type. But the 2 really big responders here were first the perennial graminoids, where prescribed fire increased perennial graminoids pretty much across the TDI board. And for the mechanical treatments, we saw a bigger increase at higher levels of TDI. And then while that's good news, it unfortunately came at the cost of increases in annual grasses with both prescribed fire and mechanical, although it was certainly worse in the prescribed fire. So now let's take a look at the cool and moist sites. So again, we see that negative effect of prescribed fire on Artemisia shrubs at low TDI and a slight increase in Artemisia shrubs with mechanical treatments. We see a little bit more of a response from the other shrubs, particularly with the prescribed fire treatments. And again, our strongest responders are perennial grasses, which responded well to both treatments. Again, for mechanical, it depended on TDI. And then annual grasses also increased, but if you note, it's not nearly as severe as at those warm and dry woodland sites. So now let's take a look at the subdominants. And those functional groups will include perennial forbs, native annual forbs, exotic annual forbs, and then lichen and moss biocrust. And so first of all, let's look at both sets of forbs. We can see the perennial forbs and the annual forbs didn't have much of a response to either one of the treatments, but they did increase a little. The exotic annual forbs, unfortunately, increased quite a bit in both treatments, again, more severe in the prescribed fire. And then the BioCrest was negatively affected by fire, especially at low TDI, and then mechanical treatments also negatively affected BioCrest across the board. Then at the cool and moist sites, we see again, or actually in contrast to the warm and dry sites, we see that those forbs are responding more strongly. You see a pretty good increase of both perennial and annual native forbs with prescribed fire. The perennial forbs responded well to the mechanical treatment as well. And then the exotic annual forbs, again, an increase with prescribed fire. It's less so in mechanical, so that's good news. And then BioCrest, again, is negatively affected by these treatments, depending on TDI, but you'll notice that there are inverse relationships there, depending on the treatment type. So now let's take a look at specific species responses. So again, the slides are set up the same. So we have big sagebrush in black, rabbitbrush is yellow, and bitterbrush is green. And again, I think we had 6 total species of Artemisia, but these are just the big sagebrush ones, which I think were 3. Again, there's a negative effect of prescribed fire at that low TDI, but we see a bump in our in big sagebrush with the mechanical treatment. And then we see weaker responses from both rabbitbrush and bitterbrush. We see a slight increase from rabbitbrush with these treatments and not much from bitterbrush. So that's at the warm dry sites. At the cool moist sites, we see more dynamic patterns with some of these species. So again, a similar pattern of negative effects of fire at low TDI, but we see a positive effect at high TDI this time. Again, increases with mechanical treatments. And then with rabbitbrush, we are seeing a response at low TDI. So we see an increase with rabbitbrush cover with prescribed fire, but not as much from the mechanical treatment. And then bitterbrush, again, has the most muted response of all. And then they do increase somewhat with the mechanical treatment. And lastly, but not least, perennial grasses. So the perennial grass species varied depending if we were at the warm and dry sites or the cool and moist sites. So at the warm and dry sites, we have blue bunch wheatgrass in black, Sandberg bluegrass is in blue, and then Indian ricegrass is in red. So we can see that blue bunch really responded to both treatments at the warm and dry sites, which is good news if that's a management objective. And then for Sandberg's bluegrass, we didn't see much of a response. And I was kind of surprised with the prescribed fire that we didn't see a bigger increase with Sandberg bluegrass. And then Indian ricegrass had a stronger response in the prescribed fire treatment than it did in the mechanical treatment. And then last, the cool and moist sites, again, we have slightly different grasses. So we have Idaho fescue in black this time. We have Sandberg bluegrass in blue again, and then bottlebreast squirreltail is in red. And the prescribed fire and mechanical treatments either had negative or positive effects on Idaho fescue. And again, that depended on that tree dominance index. For Sandberg bluegrass, we saw a stronger response at the cool and moist sites than the warm and dry sites. And again, these relationships were inversely related with TDI, depending on the treatments. And then bottlebreast squirreltail pretty consistently increased with both treatments, particularly at high TDI. So this is a lot, and there is a ton more in this paper. You could probably spend the rest of your career reading this paper in some ways. So what I decided to do is put together a summary table, and I'll just walk you through how this is set up. So it's control, prescribed fire, and mechanical. Here's our TDI across here. And then these are our warm and dry sites, and these are the cool and moist sites. So if there's a dash, it means there was no response over the 10 years. An up arrow is an increase, a down arrow is a decrease. And then the more arrows, the stronger the response was. And then I've also highlighted these by color, where the yellow boxes are undesirable conditions, and then the green boxes are desirable conditions. So first of all, let's start off with the prescribed fire effects on warm and dry sites. And this will just repeat what we saw before. So we saw that prescribed fire had a negative effect on Artemisia, a positive effect on perennial graminoids, but unfortunately came at the cost of those invasive annual grasses increasing. So if we compare that to the mechanical treatment at the warm and dry sites, we can see that the mechanical treatments had less severe effects. We actually have an increase in Artemisia shrubs, which is great. We still have that increase in perennial graminoids, although less so, and less of an increase in annual grasses. Now, if we compare warm and dry sites to cool and moist sites in the prescribed fire, we can see again that the treatment severity is much less at the cool and moist sites than it is at the warm and dry sites. And then the last comparison I'd like to make is looking at the cool and moist sites between prescribed fire and mechanical. And we can again see that we have variable responses and more positive responses to Artemisia with the mechanical treatments and fewer invasive grasses. So you can kind of stare at this for a while and pick out the broad pattern. So to conclude, prescribed fire at the warm and dry sites, we ended up with undesirable understory conditions regardless of tree dominance. But at the cool and moist sites, we had more favorable understory conditions, particularly at high tree dominance. And then for the mechanical treatments, again, we had less severe effects and there were fewer differences with soil temperature and tree dominance. We were able to sustain or increase desirable understory species, which is good news. And we had less of an increase in those invasive annual grasses. So what does this mean for management? So treatment effects were not the same across the board, obviously, and they depended upon treatment type, tree dominance, as well as soil temperature and moisture regimes. And then as we saw, different functional groups and different species within those functional groups are responding differently. So it's really important to think about what your management objectives are in these particular treatments across these gradients. So, you know, no surprise, ecosystem responses are quite complex and it warrants pretty careful thought before applying any of these treatments. And that, you know, sometimes introducing an additional disturbance like prescribed fire or mechanical treatments will have its drawbacks, and you have to figure out if those drawbacks are okay relative to your management goals. And other things that managers might consider to mitigate some of these negative effects might be subsequent seeding after these treatments. As always, we should make sure that there is appropriate livestock management after these treatments to protect what you've invested in. And then as we've seen with the soil temperature and moisture regimes, climate seems pretty important here. And so any climate change is likely to further affect plant community trajectories. And the last thing I would like to end on is just putting in a plug for a species guide that we are developing. This is geared towards managers and it's going to highlight 28 species. And this is just a mock layup. And again, we're in process with this. But our idea is that it will have a page that shows you background information of growth and habitat about each individual species. And then I'll give you management, which will include disturbance effects, restoration effects. And then we also will present each individual species response to the treatment. So again, we've gone through some of this for sandberg bluegrass, but we'll include the woodland sites, again, broken out by the two different soil temperature and moisture regimes. This time in these graphs, you can look at the changes over the years here. So we have phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 up here. So they're set up a little differently. So you'll get different information out of different publications. And we've also included the cheatgrass treatments in this species guide as well. And Dave Pike is currently working on a manuscript that we should submit soon that will highlight what's happening with particular species at the cheatgrass sites. And lastly, we are going to be seeking input from managers on how to use this. We want to make sure that you'll actually use it. So I would love if people could contact me, and as we develop this, I might ask you questions of, you know, is this a good layout? Do you need something to stick in your back pocket or print out or whatever? So with that, I think we're ready for our next speaker.
Great. Thank you, Beth. And thanks especially for mentioning this management focused guide as well, so that we recognize that sometimes journal articles are really difficult for people to get hold of, or even if they're open access like this, to sort of wade your way through. And so we've tried all the way through the SageSTEP project to come up with field guides and other kinds of tools that managers can use. And I'm really excited about this one, which will be distributed through the Great Basin Fire Science Exchange, as well as the Sagebrush Steppe Treatment Evaluation Project. With that, I'm going to introduce the last poll, and it's going to require a little more thought. So I'm going to, Jenny, if you could post the poll, go ahead and answer it. But rather than giving the results right now, let's wait until everybody's had a chance to answer it. And then I'll introduce Jason Williams, who is our last speaker. So Jason is a research hydrologist. He's currently at the USDA Agricultural Research Service in Tucson, Arizona, but he began working with us in Boise. He did his doctorate while he was part of our team, and he still looks for lots of opportunities to be able to join us and to continue work on this work, and we're really grateful for that. So with Jason, if you will go ahead and share your screen, we can move forward.
So I take it, Mark, do you want me to end the polling and show that, or?
No, go ahead. Wait till after to show the polling.
Wait till after Jason's presentation?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you, Mark. And as Mark said, I'm Jason Williams. I'm with ARS in Tucson, and I'll be talking to you today about the hydrology component of SageSTEP and associated research that we've been doing on that project over the last 10+ years. Our work in this study is really aimed at improving our understanding of surface hydrology and erosion processes on woodlands and the impacts of the tree removal practices. So this work was initially led by Dr. Fred Pearson of ARS in Boise, Idaho, with contributions from myself and several of the co-authors that you see listed here. And our work on this effort really continues through collaborations across ARS units in Boise, in Tucson, where I'm located, and also in Kimberly, Idaho. So when we began work on this project, I guess, as Mark was saying, it was in the kind of the early 2000s where they started laying the groundwork for this study. Much of what was known on surface hydrology and erosion for woodland encroached sites was based really on anecdotal evidence and maybe some studies of limited repetitions or short-term in nature. But we'll get to the components of the slide here in a second. But what I'd like to say is, those studies did provide us a nice framework for experiments and suggest that the degree to which woodland encroachment affects hydrology and erosion processes really depends on the influence of woodland encroachment on the amount and structure of cover and site attributes that define the susceptibility to runoff and erosion. So we can think of it like encroachment's influence on function largely depends on its influence on structure. And in general, some of the earlier work, as depicted on the left side here for sagebrush communities, has demonstrated that they typically have ample foliar cover and ground cover that buffers water input from precipitation events. And as such, they commonly have high infiltration rates. And runoff and erosion from these systems, usually goes only a short distance down slope. And we generally think of hydrologic and erosion processes as not being well connected for these types of well-vegetated communities. And then if we think about something like the wooded shrubland that you see here, so maybe phase 2 of woodland encroachment, runoff and erosion in these systems usually occurs, in those bare patches, but through rain splash and sheet flow processes, and becomes a little bit more well connected than for the sagebrush communities, just because there's more extensive bare ground. And we typically think of it as being perhaps a little bit more connected. Then in the later stages of woodland encroachment, like the woodland photograph you'd see in the bottom left there, there are substantial declines in understory cover that tends to propagate connectivity of bare ground, and runoff and erosion processes become more connected along hill slopes. And so that leads us sort of to this conceptual model that you can see on the right. All these relationships are represented there, and I'll come back to this model at various times during the talk today. But mainly the model shows how changes in conditions defined as susceptibility on the x-axis of the graph influence hydrologic vulnerability and erosion potential shown on the y-axis. And we note that vulnerability is also related to water input as noted by the different curves in the graph. So for sagebrush communities, we would sort of think of them as occurring sort of on this left side of the graph. As a site progresses to the later stages of phase 2 of encroachment, we would see rain splash and sheet flow processes becoming active. And then of course, in the later stages of woodland encroachment, phase 3, concentrated flow processes become more active. So, if we think about this conceptual model and the problem of woodland encroachment, we would generally think that, woodland treatments aimed at limiting runoff and erosion should target reducing bare ground and disconnecting runoff and erosion processes across scales. And so that leads me here to the overarching research questions that we have. And they're shown here. We really organize those around 3 main topics: woodland encroachment, short-term effects, and long-term effects. And for woodland encroachment, our main objectives are to improve our understanding of process connectivity and to determine if there are cover thresholds for predicting increased runoff and erosion. For our short-term objectives, those are to quantify the impacts of tree removal on hydrology and erosion processes in context with cover changes, and to develop data sets for advancing hydrologic and erosion modeling in these systems. And then our long-term objectives are include evaluation of hydrologic vulnerability and erosion potential declines with increases in cover after tree removal, and then to determine the time period required to achieve hydrologic stability on the, following the treatments that I'll talk about today. So our approach includes quantifying a suite of vegetation, ground cover, and soil attributes at multiple spatial scales, which collectively explains susceptibility as I defined it in the conceptual model. Our hydrology experiments include use of rainfall simulations at multiple plot scales, and that's to partition microsite effects and runoff and erosion by rain splash, sheet flow, and combined processes. We also include concentrated flow experiments to quantify treatment effects on overland flow hydraulics and sediment delivery. And so there's lots of the methods here, and I'm not going to describe them beyond that today, but they're well described in the papers you see cited there, which are available on the SageSTEP website at sagestep.org. So I would encourage you to go there, or you can ask questions later. So to pull off this work, we established 3 study sites in 2006, spanning conditions representative of Utah juniper, pinyon juniper, and western juniper woodlands in the Great Basin. At each site, we conducted experiments in control areas and in mechanical and fire treatment areas at various time scales after treatment. The western juniper site we selected, Castlehead, which is shown in the bottom of the slide there, burned in a wildfire prior to our experiments, and therefore we assessed that site was assessed for wildfire impacts rather than prescribed fire treatments. And our experiments across the 3 sites resulted in a pretty unique data set that includes 72 hill slope scale vegetation plots, 1,020 small plot, 352 large plot rainfall simulations, and 838 overland flow simulations, for a total of more than 2,000 hydrology erosion plot scale experiments. So it's a very unique, very nice data set for the kind of work we're trying to pull off here. So we'll start looking at some results, starting with objective 1, so the woodland encroachment component of the study. So all 3 of the woodlands that we sampled were in the later stages of woodland encroachment, so probably late phase 2, maybe early phase 3, similar to conditions like you would see in the photograph to the far left. And then the bare interspaces between the plants, so that would be photograph E in the panel to the left, were the main sources for runoff and sediment during rainfall simulation experiments. And then runoff and sediment delivery were primarily by concentrated flow processes formed by accumulation of interspace runoff and sediment throughout the inner canopy, as kind of shown by the red arrows in the photograph to the left. But all three sites fit into the conceptual model that I presented. I kind of put a bright yellow X there in that model where they might plot. But that's representative of conditions with concentrated flow as the dominant runoff and erosion mechanism, and with processes well connected across spatial scales. These are from some of our large plot rainfall simulations. As you can see in the graph to the left, runoff and erosion from those simulations exhibited a linear relationship, so sediment yield versus runoff. And that was largely due to high levels of erosion associated with concentration of runoff, particularly where bare ground exceeded 50 to 60%. So one of the things we were after are there thresholds in cover that would tell us a system is sort of approaching conditions where runoff and erosion might increase, and that threshold seems to be about 50 to 60% bare ground, which has been consistent with other studies we've done and that others have done in the Great Basin. And collectively, say these responses are typical of a degraded system relative to the hydrology and erosion processes. So over the large plot scale, the processes, as I said, were well connected through the inner canopy. You can see in the photograph to the right, that's an inner canopy plot under rainfall simulation, and you can see formation of the incised flow paths forming in the bare patches. And then looking at our data, some of the early analysis of the data, we found that the flow velocity and the probability of overland concentrate into these flows were primarily controlled by the hill slope gradient, the percent bare ground, and the flow discharge. One of the main things we were interested in for the woodland conditions is how runoff and erosion change across scales. Because as I mentioned in the conceptual model, and have come back to many times so far, it's really that connectivity of processes across scales that tells us something about how degraded these systems are. And one way to do that is to take our measures from the small plot scale, so interspaces and shrubs. I look at cumulative runoff and erosion, which I have values shown to the left here at the small plot scale, and then area weight that up over the larger spatial scale and compare it to what we measured at that large scale. Okay, so we would expect runoff and erosion to probably increase for degraded conditions and maybe decrease, for a well-vegetated site. So how did we do this? We took runoff and sediment yield measured on interspace and shrub small plots, and we area weighted those to the large plot scale based on the respective microsite areas. And the area weighted estimates were then compared with measured large plot intercanopy runoff and sediment yield. And what we found is that runoff was pretty similar across spatial scales, but it occurred in a different way. So at the large spatial scale, when we measured it, runoff was really occurring more in terms of concentrated flow rather than rain splash and sheet flow. The bare ground allowed that water to accumulate, move down slope at a higher velocity, and therefore generating increasing erosion rates with increasing spatial scale. And so this is pretty consistent with our field observations and is sort of indicative, again, of a more degraded condition. So we'll now look at the effects of some of the treatments. We'll start with fire. These are large plot rainfall simulation data from the Castlehead site that burned in a wildfire. And what we see is that fire induced this sort of exponential shift in erosion per unit of runoff as measured for the large rainfall simulation plots. For the unburned condition, runoff and erosion exhibited this linear relationship, but as depicted in the graph, so here's the linear relationship, but as depicted here, erosion per unit of runoff takes this shift immediately post-fire. This is largely due to the loss of cover, as you can see on the burn plot there. Persistent of strong soil water repellency assessed by the water drop penetration time method, and then well-connected runoff and sediment sources and processes on these plots. And so these are our soil water repellency data. This is the water drop penetration time over 0 to 5 centimeters depth. And pretty much anything over 60 seconds we consider to be strongly water repellent. And we had that for the unburned condition and the burned condition. For the unburned condition, the litter tends to buffer that effect, but once it's removed by fire, that tends to propagate runoff, which then moves across the plot, forms these concentrated flow paths. And then that's one of the main reasons for this exponential change in that runoff and sediment yield relationship. So back to our conceptual model, we know that if we start over here in the phase 3 woodland in the graphic to the right, the big yellow circle, with fire, we kind of increased our susceptibility and hydrologic vulnerability in the short term, but the real question is what happens in the long term. And what we saw, you can see kind of this photograph of the midterm over here on the left, 2 to 3 years after fire, the herbaceous response in cover tended to spread the flow out and maybe limit downslope movement of water and sediment. But again, the real question is what happens in the long term. So here are some photographs at the marking corral and the Oniki site for the control condition, the short-term post-fire, and then the long-term, which is in this case 9 years post-fire. And you can see the differences in cover across those, across the control and the treated condition there. And then we have cumulative runoff, graphs of cumulative runoff and cumulative sediment on the right. And then I've highlighted the intercanopy areas with the red ovals for the control condition, and the intercanopy area in the burn with the blue ovals there. And really what we see is that by the 9th year post-fire, substantial cover increases in intercanopy areas limited the runoff and sediment yield as measured on these plots. And these areas make up more than 75% of the area at both sites. And the intercanopy was the primary source for runoff and sediment delivery pre-treatment. And we've seen a dramatic reduction in both runoff and sediment in both cases. So this suggests that fire-induced increases in perennial grasses can effectively improve infiltration and limit downslope runoff and sediment transport, even for these phase 3 woodlands, if we do get the kind of cover response you see depicted here. Of course, as you've heard from the other speakers, and as many of you know, there's perhaps a downside to fire. We did see cheatgrass increases with the prescribed fire treatment. But at least on the sites we were at, most of the cheatgrass cover was on these tree islands. You can see the photograph in the bottom right here. It was these burned tree pockets that had most of the cheatgrass, and they're surrounded by intercanopy that was filled with perennial bunch grasses. So this represents about 25% of the area at the 2 sites that you see left. Okay, well now get some treatment results from the cut mastication treatments, beginning with the cut. So these are cumulative runoff and sediment yield values from rainfall simulations in intercanopy areas within the cut in the first year post-treatment. We don't need to really spend a lot of time looking at the cumulative values there. They're just for those that are interested, but the photographs across the top are for intercanopies in the control areas at 3 sites, and then the graphs on the bottom are treated areas at those same sites. There was really a negligible impact initially for the cut treatment, partly because it takes time for the cover to respond. We anticipated cutting trees and dropping them into the intercanopy might trap runoff and limit runoff and sediment transport, but that was not the case. The limbs of the trees tended to bridge the base of the tree and lift it up off of the ground in that fresh cut condition, and water was able to move and pass underneath the trees and even form rills, as you can see in the photographs here. So no favorable initial impact from cutting. You can see photographs here of the cut area to the right 9 years after cutting, and then this is the control. This is at the Oniki site. You can see quite a bit of bare ground even 9 years after the treatment at this particular site. There is perhaps some increased productivity of grasses, and there were increases in cover as we measured it on these plots. But if we look at the hydrologic function, it didn't change a lot. We can see infiltration curves for marking corral and Oniki in the graphs slide. And then we can focus on the red and orange lines in both graphs. The left graph is marking corral and the right is for the Oniki site. This is infiltration, again measured on small plots. The orange lines are infiltration rates for interspaces in the cut treatment, and then the solid red lines are interspaces within the control. And so there's some slight increases in infiltration. We saw a similar response for sediment discharge, but overall the hydrologic function was only slightly improved and not statistically different from the controls. However, cut trees in the 9th year post-treatment were in good contact with the ground surface in contrast to the short-term results. And those effectively trapped runoff and sediment along the hill slopes. And you can see photographs at the top of the slide there for control interspace plots, and then for control intercanopy plots, and then intercanopy plots in the treatment areas at the same 2 sites, Marking Corral and Oniki, are shown at the bottom with and without the down tree. And the values you see there are cumulative runoff in liters and cumulative sediment in grams from overland flow experiments. And again, we don't need to hang up too much on the exact numbers there, but just the relative differences between them are pretty substantial for the cut tree plots. And you can see the effect of the trees in limiting runoff and sediment yield in the cut treatment.
Got about 2 minutes, Jason.
Okay, I'm wrapping up. So these are some results from the mastication treatment. In the short term, the mastication treatment at the Oniki site really didn't spread tree debris very much into the inner canopy, so we did that manually. And you can see the photographs in the bottom of vegetated interspaces and bare interspaces without the mulch, and then those what they look like when we spread the mulch into them. And then the graphs at the top show the differences in infiltration and sediment discharge for mulch-free and mulched interspaces. So substantial improvement in infiltration and reduction in sediment discharge with the mulch treatment. However, 9 years post-treatment, cover had improved a little bit, and we did see some slight reductions in runoff shown in the graphs there and cumulative sediment for the intercanopy areas. But those were not significantly different between control and mastication treatment. So much like the cut, there is an improvement in hydrology, but it's a little slower to respond than the prescribed fire treatment. We did go back to these sites in 2019. So this would be 13 years post-treatment. You can see photographs there to the left of the Oniki site for the control and the different treatments at that point in time. We looked at the vegetation across the treatments. And then for the hydrology side, we looked at the hydraulic conductivity as measured by a mini disc infiltrometer. And these results were pretty consistent with the 9 years post-treatment data. That is, hydraulic conductivity, as shown by the red bar here in the burn, was the highest. And it was the cut and the burns were similar, and the cut and the controls were similar. So really what this is telling us is that along with the experiments from the 9th year post-treatment, it's indicating that the enhanced vegetation and ground cover in the burn treatments improving hydrologic function, and did so by the 9th year, but the conditions in the mechanical treatments are trending towards improved hydrologic function with time. So we'll talk a little bit about RIM, but I'll cruise through that given our time limitations. But one of the things I did want to point out is that much of the data collected in SageSTEP has helped us improve RIM. This is a USDA ARS model that can be applied. It's designed specifically for application to rangelands. There are a host of parameters kind of behind the interface that drive the model. The model can be set up to look at things like woodland encroachment impacts. If you took a sagebrush site, you can model it as sagebrush as a woodland and show different treatment effects by modeling the cover changes associated with those. But these data that we've collected in this project have greatly helped us improve some of the parameterization of the model. These are just some examples for the friction factor, the velocity, and the flow width parameters in the model. And we don't have to get specific into the equations, but mainly to recognize these data are helping us to make sure we're representing the things that control hydrology and erosion in these systems. So cover variables and some of the physical components of discharge and slope. So in summary here, to wrap up, I'd say that the project's provided us well-replicated data. It's increased our understanding of woodland encroachment effects on hydrology and erosion. It's given us short and long-term hydrologic and erosion impact information for tree removal treatments. And it's allowed us to deliver improved model capabilities for modeling hydrologic function in these woodlands. And of course, there have been numerous peer-reviewed publications and syntheses that are available through the SageSTEP website. Our ongoing work includes continuing monitoring at the sites, and we're also moving towards doing some rim modeling across the entire SageSTEP network to look at the hydrologic impacts of the treatments across all of the woodland sites in the network. And so hopefully we'll have the first paper on that effort in the Ecosphere special issue you've heard folks talk about already today. Much of the data from the first 9 years of the study are now available in the Ag Data Commons, and were highlighted in our paper describing that data set in ESSD published earlier this year. And then pretty much all of the papers should be available at sagestep.org, or you can email me specifically to get a copy of those, or if you have any questions about the study and the results and the products we have available. And that wraps it up for me, Mark.
Great. Thanks, Jason. And thank all of you who have stuck with us for this. At this point, I'm going to invite all of the speakers to unmute and to show their faces. And we have a question and answer session ready to go here. While I want to also mention that we've added one person, Dave Pike, who will join us for the discussion, but was not one of our speakers. And Dave is another longtime research ecologist, was with the U.S. Geological Survey's office in Corvallis, and he also has just recently retired. So for those of you who are thinking about SageSTEP is lasting longer than careers, and that's something that we're really proud of. So, Jeannie, just for a second, can you show us what the answers to the last poll? Okay, so there was at least one surprise in the data for about half of you, and only 16% no, this is exactly what I thought. And that's really helpful to us, because it helps us recognize the value of this kind of research, and it helps us make the case that we need to be funded some more so we can continue doing it. So some of you have been putting questions into the chat all along. If you have more questions, we can still do that, but I have gathered a few questions that I've been gleaning from the work we've got before. Some of them have been answered by speakers during the session. But this one is probably to anybody who wants to answer it. And the speaker said, well, even though this is an experiment, and so the data that we're looking at primarily are really limited to what's going on in our sites, are we able to consider at all the effects of landscape level or disturbance differences? So for example, is there any way for us to consider things like invasive plant vectors that may come because of proximity of roads or something else going on?
I'll start it off. I would say we can incorporate some of those things. It was not designed in that fashion, but the unique thing about SageSTEP is the fact that as a project, it uses larger than normal applications. And so our fuel treatments ranged in size from roughly 70 acres up to 200 acres in size. And then we also had some prescribed fire treatments that were in excess of 1,000 acres in size. So the fact is that it provides us some opportunities to do that. For some of the earlier work that was done on birds, they did incorporate some of the landscape components associated with the surrounding areas as well.
Anyone else want to have a thought about that?
I would add to that There hasn't been a lot on our team that we've done with the spatial relationships between different ecosystem components and our treatment plots. However, we've had several people who have used chunks of our data and have used this for outside applications to answer more landscape questions. We would also say if there are folks who have that interest, Mark talked at the beginning, but I'll reiterate it, that we are always looking for new partners. So if there are folks that want to look at those spatial relationships, we're super happy to talk about that. And I'll find that link again and put it in the chat.
I would jump in and say that early on we have done multivariate analyses of these sites, and I would point to some of Bruce Roundy's work where he looked at more ordinations and those kinds of approaches to kind of ferret out the differing effects of some of the abiotic variables on treatment response.
Great, thanks. This is a question that was originally directed to Jean, but others may have thoughts about this as well. You know, we found in some cases that there were higher densities of sagebrush recovery. And the question was, is it possible that having these higher densities could actually be counterproductive for restoring the main elements of resistance and resilience?
So I'm certainly happy to jump in on that. I think there are several things that need to be considered. I think part of that question was where we would want to increase sagebrush densities. And I would suggest that in order to maximize resource use following some of the more severe disturbances and specifically fire, we would certainly want to have sagebrush established on those sites. In terms of our drier sites, where we're looking at things like mowing and long-term effects of slow-acting herbicides, I think that is a valid question in terms of what do we really perceive these sites as functioning like in the future. And having, again, a diverse mix of species is, I think, a positive aspect. In terms of will sagebrush compete with the perennial grasses? Certainly it will. So, and that is partly, I think, why we see the densities of sagebrush we do in a lot of our warm and dry sites. And of course, the impetus for doing that. And part of the mechanism is historic livestock grazing as well as abiotic conditions on those sites. That may not have actually answered the direct question, but I think it's important to consider all components and understand what these field treatments are doing in terms of ecosystem processes in general. It's not only lack of recruitment of sagebrush we're seeing on a lot of these sites. We're probably not seeing much recruitment of perennial grasses either, even though they are increasing in cover.
Yeah, I'll jump in from there, Jean, because I think that is, especially on the warmer, drier sites, the fact that any of the treatments where we kill a sagebrush plant, one of the objectives that we were hoping to be able to see with this study was that you would have that competitive release and you would see increases in seed production of the perennial grasses and therefore see some of the perennial grasses filling in some of those areas where the sagebrush was eliminated. And our data, which we, I think it was Lisa and Beth were talking about, that we've got one more paper that will be coming out. I was disappointed that we didn't get increases in densities of the perennial grasses. We had some fluctuations in densities with Sandberg's bluegrass, but for the deep-rooted perennial grasses, we didn't see increases in densities of them. We did see increases in cover that occurred, but sometimes that could be changed with increases in cover of cheatgrass. So as cheatgrass cover went up, the cover of the perennial grasses can in some cases start to go down. So there's that flux between what's going on. If you only maintain the same number of perennial grasses on the site and you don't increase with new recruits, then basically those voids that where you've eliminated sagebrush may only be increased by things like cheatgrass coming into those areas. So it's a concern that we still have, and one that I'm not sure that we have an answer as to how the system will actually sort itself out. 10 years down the road, I still think we have a lot of questions and not as many answers as we'd hoped to have had after 10 years.
Great, thanks, Dave. Here's a question that I think several of you may have thoughts about. This is specific to some of the things that managers can use. How are we able to, how are these findings informing the development or adjustment of state and transition models for the Great Basin? Or are they?
I can take that. I have done some work with Kendra Mosley with NRCS. It wasn't SageSTEP data, but it was other field data. And I could see continuing along that line of collaboration to see how we can inform to improve on some of those. I think that Jean and one of her project teams is also working with Kendra.
Yes, we are not specifically with the SageSTEP data, but I will say that a lot of our earlier SageSTEP work was pretty influential in terms of developing more generalized resilience and resistance state and transition models for specifically our western sagebrush range, the Great Basin in particular.
Great. Here's something that I hadn't thought of in all the times that I've been thinking about SageSTEP. And a little bit of context, when we started this, cheatgrass was our big concern. In the last 15 years, we've seen a significant increase in vetonata and medusa head. And I was listening to a talk on Monday by Amanda Bentley Breimer, where she found that the livestock producers in particular have figured out how to work with cheatgrass. And at this point, they're worried much more about vetonata and medusa head. And so the question was, does the model that we've developed, or the models we've developed, how well or can we transfer them at all to other invasive annuals such as vetonata or medusa head?
So, of course, the cheatgrass model, the current resistance emphasis has been on the abiotic characteristics that facilitate establishment and persistence of cheatgrass. And that actually works quite well for cheatgrass. But as we know, vetonata can tolerate colder temperatures, and medusa head also occurs on different soil types. So one of the things we've recently done is to conduct an analysis of many of the different invasive annual grasses and forbs that have been sampled in the AIM plot data. And that was recently published as a diversity and distributions paper. And it basically shows what are the controlling variables, the controlling abiotic variables for these different species. Another source of information on that is our Bromus book that we published in 2016. And the first chapter by Matt Brooks has illustrations of how we would anticipate different invasive annual grasses in particular to perform, if you will, or how resistant the ecosystem is, if you want to look at it in the opposite context, across environmental gradients. And so, for example, if we think about red brome, we know that it is adapted to warmer conditions. We typically see it farther south in the Mojave or in our lower valleys in the Intermountain region. And so we can pretty well predict, based upon understanding its abiotic requirements, again, for establishment and persistence, where we would likely see it. We also can or have reasonable information on Japanese brome and several other species. Right now, we really don't have sufficient information on Ventonata, although we know that Becky Kearns is working on that over in Oregon. And I know that her crew is producing quite a few manuscripts that hopefully will provide good insights as to, again, its constraints in terms of establishment and persistence.
So we have about 5 minutes left, and there's a question, a great question here that I wanted to end with, and it's for all it says for all the speakers, but I would ask Dave if he wanted to weigh in as well. And the question, so we'd have about a minute each, but the question is, what would you say is the biggest drawback to our research or our data set? And where are the room for improvements, or what would we say would be the next step?
Mark, I could go first if you'd like on that. So I think one of the biggest drawbacks is that our plots are excluded from grazing. And so it's important to take that into context, that some of these patterns may differ once you introduce grazing. And I had another thought just a second ago that I lost. The other, it's not really a drawback of the experimental design per se, but we have just touched the surface on a lot of these results. And we described the patterns that have happened over time, but we really haven't been able to use the data to look at mechanisms. Now that data is there, we just haven't had the capacity to do it. And we did a group meeting this past spring, fall, COVID brain, I forget what time that was, last fall. And we talked about research directions. And so someone had brought up landscape processes, and that was one thing that we were interested in pursuing. And another big piece there was looking at mechanisms of these patterns. So especially with some of these species interactions, we're describing them very broadly, but we could really dive more into that.
Okay, thanks. Who wants to go next?
Well, I mean, I can speak to the just to the hydrology side. The hydrology experiments I talked about today are very resource demanding, and that's why we were only able to pull those off at 3 sites. So being able to do that at many more sites would be advantageous, as well as to do something other than the sort of experiments we conducted with static rainfall intensities to be able to look at responses under natural rainfall events. And then just to keep watching these sites over time, because they're continuing to change. So, originally the short-term funding was a 5-year study, but I think it's going to be important to stay with this over the long run to really see how things change. So there's my 2 cents.
Thanks. Lisa, what are you thinking?
If I could go back to the very beginning, what I wish we had was a set of targeted grazing plots for all of the Sage Cheat network, given how important that is right now for managers and is what a lot of people are considering doing. But given that we cannot go back in time, where I think that we can grow is we've done a lot of work kind of within our disciplinary expertises, and we've done very little of merging across the different types of data sets that SageSTEP is working with. So, kind of as we move beyond this, first 10 years into the second decade of SageSTEP, I'm really looking forward to, collaborating with some folks within the team, the different things and what I do, and start to bring some of those data sets together. And, that ties back to the earlier landscape scale question. And I think one of the things that we have a gold mine of data to do is start looking at landscape scale questions, looking at the spatial arrangement among different elements within our systems.
Cool. Jean?
I think everyone has made excellent points. I agree with and I'm assuming, Lisa, you're talking about with insight, spatial arrangement of the components. just to kind of clarify that. So I think that makes great sense. I thought that, I think that while it is a broadly dispersed experiment, it would have been great to have had more plots. I think all we needed was some more money.
Yeah.
And yeah, and I guess I would just diverge from the question a bit and say that we are finding all sorts of great applications for the data. And I would mention a new Joint Fire Science, recently new, Joint Fire Sciences program project that is actually going to use the data that Lisa is generating on the results of the woody fuel treatments in terms of fire behavior to kind of inform more broadly fire risk models for the Great Basin and for the areas that we have really examined. So while yes, we could have done more, I think that we're still actively pursuing a lot of really great questions, and that the SageSTEP project is going to contribute to many different aspects into the future.
And Dave, because you get the last word here.
Yeah, I'm looking back at where we began. We had to decide how we were going to monitor the vegetation plots that we had, and we made some pretty strict decisions on how we were going to do that. One of the things that pretty much got eliminated and didn't get looked at was this whole aspect associated with the population dynamics. And we've tried to tease that out to some degree, but unfortunately, doing work with trying to determine how these treatments impacted seed production on plants and how the weather every year may have affected that seed production as well. That's one of the things that I wish we could have gotten that kind of information. We lack that across the Great Basin for some of these dominant plant species. There's been a lot of people that have tried to get at this to some degree. Unfortunately, it would have really been good to track that over time on several of these sites. The second thing, and this kind of goes along with looking back and saying that I really wish that we would overlaid the livestock grazing on top of this, or targeted grazing. The other aspect that we were constantly being asked by some of the managers of some of these sites was, can we do some revegetation along with this? And I would have loved to have taken half the plots and been able to go in and done some reseeding efforts, with local seeds versus commercially available seed and those kinds of things. But you have to make decisions as to where you're going to cut back.
Yeah, great. Well, I want to thank all of our speakers once again, and Dave for joining us, and thank everyone for listening. We've gone a few minutes, like 3 minutes over, and so I want to let everybody go, but thanks everyone for a great symposium.